Nothing appears more fundamental to human experience than solidity. We trust the ground beneath our feet, the chair holding our weight, the walls around us. Even thoughts can feel dense and stubborn, as if they possess a heaviness that resists change. But the closer we look at matter, mind, and the fabric of reality itself, the more the illusion of solidity dissolves. Modern physics, cognitive science, and quantum theory converge to reveal something startling. Nothing is solid. Not the world you touch, not the self you believe you inhabit, not even the thoughts that seem to define your identity. This is not a mystical metaphor, but a direct consequence of the universe's most fundamental structures. To understand why requires a journey into quantum thinking, a synthesis of physics and introspective inquiry that reframes how we relate to existence. Reality appears solid only because our senses and our thinking apparatus operate at a frequency that makes fluidity appear static. Solidity is a perceptual convenience, not a property of the universe. At the smallest scales, matter reveals itself as mostly empty space adorned with improbable clouds of energy, and the boundaries we believe separate objects dissolve into patterns of relational dynamics. At the cognitive level, thoughts behave much like quantum phenomena, arising probabilistically, interacting, and collapsing into decisions only when observed. The sense of solidity, of objects, beliefs, and identity, is a reconstruction produced by the brain to manage an overwhelming ocean of possibilities. The very notion of a fixed self collapses once we examine the machinery of perception with the same rigor that quantum physics applies to particles. In the quantum view of being, the solidity we cling to is not only inaccurate, but also limiting. Its dissolution opens a new mode of comprehension in which fluidity, relationality, and uncertainty become resources rather than threats. To see how deeply embedded this illusion is, consider that what we call matter is a temporary organization of fluctuating fields. The atoms composing your body consist of a nucleus occupying an unimaginably tiny fraction of the atom's volume, surrounded by electron probabilities rather than solid objects. If the nucleus were the size of a marble, the nearest electrons would orbit several football fields away. Yet this enormous emptiness feels tangible because electromagnetic forces resist compression. What we experience as solidity is not physical compactness, but resistance, fields pushing against each other. Touching something solid is not matter meeting matter, but the force fields of your atoms refusing to overlap with the force fields of another structure. The solidity of a stone, a table, or a hand is the outward expression of quantum rules preventing identical particles from occupying the same state. Solidity is therefore an emergent experience, not an inherent attribute. The chair holds you up not because it is solid, but because the Pauli exclusion principle prevents the electrons in your body from sinking through the electrons in the chair. This physical illusion parallels the illusion of solidity in thought. Just as matter appears fixed, but is actually a shimmering dance of probabilities, thoughts appear stable, but are transient bursts of neural firing. A belief feels solid because it has been rehearsed, reinforced, emotionally charged, and woven into identity. But when observed closely, through introspection, meditation, or cognitive analysis, thoughts dissolve into patterns of activation that arise and pass, lacking inherent substance. You cannot hold a thought any more than you can grasp an electron. Even the most persistent mental narratives are not solid structures, but habits of pattern recurrence. The brain constructs the illusion of solidity for the same reason quantum fields produce the illusion of objects. Stability is evolutionarily useful. The organism benefits from perceiving a world of discrete, predictable things and a self that can act upon them. But the deep truth is that stability is an interpretation, not a property of reality. Quantum thinking begins with accepting that the brain is not a passive receiver of a fixed external world, but an active participant shaping what it perceives. Every perception is a collapse of possibilities. Each moment of consciousness selects one interpretation from countless potential interpretations, just as a quantum system collapses into one measurable state when observed. The observer and the observed are entangled, and neither exists independently in any absolute sense. This applies as much to internal mental states as to external phenomena. When you focus on a thought, you collapse its fuzzy potential into a definite form. When you release attention, the thought dissolves back into a cloud of possibilities. Consciousness itself behaves like a quantum system, with attention functioning as the measurement that selects an outcome. Physical solidity is further undermined when we examine the nature of particles. In quantum field theory, particles are not small solid balls, but excitations of underlying fields. A photon is a disturbance in the electromagnetic field. An electron is a vibration in the electron field. These excitations have no fixed boundaries. They spread out across space, interact with other fields, and take on properties only when measured. A particle does not occupy a single location until observed. Before measurement, it exists as a probability distribution. Even after measurement, the notion of a solid, localized object is a mathematical convenience, not a literal description. At the deepest level, there are no objects, only interactions. What we experience as a solid entity is a persistent pattern within a field of relationships. Much like a whirlpool appears to be a thing, but is actually a stable configuration of flowing water. Thoughts follow a similar pattern. A belief is not a solid object stored in the brain. It is a temporary configuration of neural pathways activated in response to a stimulus. The idea of a fixed memory is as misleading as the idea of a fixed particle. Memories change each time they are recalled. Thoughts evolve as contexts shift, and the self that recalls them is itself a dynamic process. Just as matter is a ripple in a field, the self is a ripple in consciousness. It maintains continuity not because it is solid, but because it persists as a pattern. Personal identity is a stable appearance generated by continual reconstruction, a narrative continuity rather than a static structure. Quantum thinking invites us to view reality not as a collection of objects, but as a network of relationships. Solidity arises only within particular scales and contexts. At the level of human perception, chairs, bodies, and stones behave predictably enough to appear solid. At the quantum level, nothing is solid. At the cosmological level, even space-time becomes dynamic and flexible. Reality is scale-dependent, and solidity is a scale-specific illusion. Understanding this requires holding multiple perspectives simultaneously. Classical thinking insists on fixed categories and discrete entities. Quantum thinking embraces fluidity and superposition, the capacity for things to be many things at once depending on how they are observed. The illusion of solidity also shapes how we interpret time. We tend to think of the past as fixed, the present as solid, and the future as unformed. Yet modern physics suggests that time is not a linear flow, but a dimension woven into the fabric of space-time. Just as matter has no solid boundaries, time has no inherent flow. The experience of temporal solidity, the feeling that the present moment stands apart, is produced by the brain's need to create order from continuous change. From a quantum perspective, the present is a collapse of possibilities that extend both backward and forward. The brain constructs a story of linear time just as it constructs the solidity of a table or the continuity of a self. When we apply quantum thinking to the mind, a profound shift occurs. Thoughts cease to be heavy, immovable structures and reveal themselves as waves of potential. Inner resistance softens, and the rigidity of belief dissolves. Just as particles assume properties only when observed, thoughts gain power only when we invest attention into them. A negative thought becomes solid when repeatedly observed. A limiting belief persists because we keep collapsing the same possibility over and over. When attention is withdrawn, the thought returns to a state of potentiality. This does not trivialize human emotion or cognitive struggle, but acknowledges that mental structures are more malleable than they appear. The solidity of suffering is as illusory as the solidity of matter. Quantum thinking transforms our relationship with reality by reframing certainty as an outdated construct. In a universe where nothing is truly solid, clinging to rigid interpretations becomes unnecessary. Instead, fluidity becomes a mode of understanding. You can interpret challenges as patterns rather than obstacles, possibilities rather than barriers. The dissolution of solidity frees you to shape your experience. This mindset does not abandon logic, it expands it. It recognizes that the linear, deterministic worldview is only one approximation among many, and that embracing uncertainty can yield greater clarity than resisting it. The dissolution of solidity has ethical implications as well. If nothing is truly separate, then the apparent boundaries between self and other are conceptual rather than actual. Quantum entanglement demonstrates that particles separated by vast distances can influence each other instantly, suggesting that separation is not fundamental. In human experience, empathy mirrors entanglement. Your emotional state influences others, and theirs influences you, often in ways that transcend direct communication. The illusion of a solid, isolated self obscures the interconnected nature of consciousness. When this illusion dissolves, compassion becomes a natural outcome. Seeing others as part of the same unfolding pattern changes how we act. The dissolution of solidity makes space for relational intelligence, a deeper awareness of how actions ripple through the network of being. The most challenging aspect of quantum thinking is not the physics, but the psychological shift it requires. The mind craves solidity because solidity provides security. But in a universe where nothing is static, security must be redefined. Instead of seeking stability in fixed structures, quantum thinking embraces stability within adaptability. A tree is stable not because it is rigid, but because it bends with the wind. A mind is resilient not because its beliefs are unchanging, but because it can update them. Quantum thinking turns uncertainty into a creative medium rather than a source of fear. It teaches that fluidity is not chaos but the natural state of reality. As we examine the mechanics of perception, we discover that the solidity of the external world and the solidity of inner thoughts share a common source: pattern recognition. The brain compresses overwhelming input into manageable categories. Objects are defined by boundaries that the brain draws based on sensory data. Thoughts are defined by boundaries drawn from memory and emotion. These boundaries give rise to solidity. But quantum thinking reveals that boundaries are conceptual overlays rather than literal divisions. Reality does not present itself in neatly packaged units. It is an unbroken flow. The mind divides the flow into objects, thoughts, and identities because doing so aids survival. Recognizing the artificial nature of these divisions does not negate their usefulness, but prevents them from becoming prisons. In everyday life, solidity manifests as certainty, identity, and narrative. Certainty feels solid, but it is a closure of possibility. Identity feels solid, but it is a composite of changing processes. Narrative feels solid, but it is a retrospective arrangement of events shaped by emotional bias. In quantum thinking, these structures remain functional but no longer define the limits of what is possible. Thought becomes a tool rather than a master. Identity becomes a fluid interface rather than a cage. Narrative becomes a map rather than territory. When we release solidity, we gain freedom without losing coherence. The dissolution of solidity opens a new understanding of creativity. Creativity is not the generation of solid ideas, but the exploration of potential states before they collapse into form. A painting begins as a superposition of possibilities. A solution to a problem exists in the space of potential before the mind selects one path. Creativity thrives when thoughts are allowed to remain fluid long enough for novel configurations to emerge. Rigid thinking collapses possibilities prematurely, just as premature measurement collapses a quantum wave function. Quantum thinking nurtures creativity by extending the space of potential before committing to form. This perspective reshapes our sense of consciousness itself. If thoughts are not solid and the self is not solid, consciousness cannot be a fixed entity. It must be a dynamic field, continually interacting with physical reality and internal patterns. Some theories propose that consciousness is fundamental, not derivative, a field as real as the electromagnetic field. In such models, matter and mind are complementary expressions of a deeper underlying reality. Solidity then becomes a perceptual artifact at the intersection of consciousness and physical structure. The universe may be a vast interplay of informational fields, with consciousness acting as the observer, interpreter, and participant. Whether or not consciousness is fundamental, its experience of solidity is clearly constructed. Recognizing this construction is the cornerstone of quantum thinking. In the end, saying that nothing is solid is not an assertion of emptiness, but an invitation to see the richness beneath appearances. Matter is dynamic. Thoughts are dynamic. And the universe itself is a tapestry of interactions without fixed edges. The dissolution of solidity does not make reality less meaningful. It makes it more alive. It reveals that stability is a dance, identity is a process, and perception is a co-creative act. To think quantumly is to live in alignment with the true nature of existence, not as a collection of solid things, but as an evolving, interconnected field of possibilities. When solidity dissolves, what remains is freedom, the freedom to reinterpret, to evolve, to transcend the boundaries that once felt immovable. The world becomes spacious, the mind becomes flexible, and consciousness becomes an open horizon through which reality continuously reshapes itself. This is the essence of quantum thinking, and it begins with understanding the most counterintuitive yet profound truth. Nothing is solid, not even your thoughts.